Hello, my name is Cesar Daher Carleso, and today I'll be speaking about Venezuela, the country I chose for my case studies. Before beginning, I wanted to start with a brief overview of what I'll be talking about during my presentation. Listed here are 3 topics from our case studies, which I believe present Venezuela as holistically as possible to anyone not familiar with its historical and contemporary developments. With that said, in my first section, I talk about Venezuela's colonial history and the central figures which shaped it. This, of course, being the period from when Spain colonizes Venezuela to when it declares its independence. From there, I shift to talk about the economic activities Venezuela has undertaken to develop after its independence. And lastly, I talk about the relationship the United States and Venezuela have today. Having gone over all of these sections, I conclude by summarizing the main points of each and seeing where Venezuela can go from there, where Venezuela can go forward from there. My first section, as I said, is Venezuela's colonial history and its central figures. This is a time period ranging from 1521 to 1830. In 1521, Spain officially colonizes Venezuela and integrates it into the Viceroyalty of New Granada, which was a viceroyalty ruled by a viceroy in present-day Bogotá. Like we learned in other colonies, Spain mainly used Venezuela to extract resources. It imported slaves to work in the plantations, it imported slaves to raise cattle, and to work in gold mines as well. In turn, Spain took these resources and brought them from Venezuela over to enrich its coffers and fund its European activities. But these expenditures for Spain grew costlier, and by the beginnings of the 1800s, Spain's increasing extraction of these resources angered Creoles in Venezuela. Creoles, of course, being people born in Venezuela but of European descent. Because of high taxes, limited opportunities for social mobility, racial discrimination, and mismanagements, Creoles grew increasingly weary of rule by Spain and started considering and talking openly about rebellion. By 1811, 3 radicals within Venezuela's newly formed separatist government pushed for unconditional independence. They were Simón Bolívar, Francisco de Miranda, and José Félix Rivas. Later that year, Venezuela went on to become the first South American nation to formally sever its ties to Spain. While Francisco de Miranda and José Félix Rivas were captured by the Spanish, Simón Bolívar managed to build on their successes and eventually liberate Venezuela in 1820. In this slide, I'd like to point out the picture at the bottom, which is a depiction of the Viceroyalty of New Granada. It also shows what countries comprise New Granada. So you can see it is made up of Panama, Ecuador, part of Peru, part of Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and Guyana. I'd also like to take the opportunity to highlight this painting. It is titled The 5th of July, 1811, and it is made by Juan Loberra in that same year. It depicts similar events which transpired here in the United States, where central figures met up to draft a Declaration of Independence. And here, as I mentioned, are the 3 central figures of the Creole Rebellion movement, which are Francisco de Miranda in the front, José Félix Rivas to a side, and between them, Simón Bolívar, a little obscured in the back. So from there, I'll go on to talk about post-independence economic development, which ranges from 1830 to 1998. After its independence, Venezuela inherited colonial debt from Spain. This was a common trend for former Spanish colonies, in which they would declare independence but still be indebted to Spain for its expenditures that it made in each territory. In the case of Venezuela, it took out loans from Germany, Britain, and Italy to pay out its own loans, To do so, that is to say, to garner the funds to pay off these loans, it centered its economy around agriculture, but this was to little avail. In 1902, Venezuela's ports became blockaded by its creditors after defaulting on the foreign loans it took out to pay out its other foreign loan to Spain. Venezuela, however, recovered quickly. In 6 years, that is, in 1908, it became one of the world's largest oil exporters under the leadership of Juan Vicente Gómez. But in 1989, its economy lagged due to governmental mismanagement. As a result, Venezuela elected hardliner Carlos Andrés Pérez. His administration grew increasingly popular after boosting the economy through the use of loans from the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. Here's evidence another common trend in the region, where underdeveloped Latin American countries interchange their loans from European countries to loans from the United States. For these loans, the IMF, which is run by the United States, pushes neoliberal policies which favors its interests within these countries. In the case of Venezuela, the IMF demanded a single floating exchange rate, the liberalization of interest rates, and higher prices for state-produced goods and services, such as electricity and gasoline, both of which the US had heavily invested in. But Pérez's popularity sunk after his decision to impose these neoliberal reforms. Mass popular protests ensued over the rise of the price of goods, especially the rise of the price of previously cheap oil. These increases gave rise to the election of Hugo Chávez Frías in 1998, and his legacy still weighs on Venezuelans today. Again, just to point out the pictures that are here on the slide, at the top you see a German gunboat, which could be said to be very similar to those which blockaded the ports of Venezuela back in 1902. To the right of that picture is a Venezuelan refinery erected in the oil boom of 1908 and from the oil boom which ranged from 1908 to 1935. At the bottom of that picture is the headquarters of the IMF, and to the left is a picture of Chavez. A humorous picture, but I'd like to clarify that he is anything but a humorous figure. From there, I transition to my last topic, which is Venezuela and the US today. And it is a period which ranges from 1998, the election of Chavez, to the present day. In 1998, that is to say, Chavez's election, there's a general consensus that that is the genesis of the US's interest in ousting the current Venezuelan regime. Why? Because after his victory in 98, Chavez repetitively angered the Bush administration. It undermined the Bush administration's foreign policy in the region. Venezuela mildly thwarted the US's imposed isolation on Cuba by exporting 1/3 of the petroleum necessary to run the small island state. Chavez also enjoyed a very public relationship with Fidel Castro, much to the anger of the US. In addition to that, Chavez also sought to centralize the economy to fund his Bolivarian Revolution. The Bolivarian Revolution being a redistributive social movement meant to prop up the country's poor. What was troublesome to the United States was the way in which Chavez attempted to carry out this goal, which was to expropriate several American assets in Venezuela, the most prominent of which were General Motors, ExxonMobil, and ConocoPhillips plants. But in actuality, this centralization only bred corruption. Public officials pocketed most of the revenue, and again, this has led to mismanagement and to a current civil and political crisis which has drawn the attention of the US. The instability of the Venezuelan crisis has caused regional allies to increasingly demand the U.S. impose pressure on the Venezuelan regime, on the current Venezuelan regime. It has done so by imposing sanctions, backing the opposition, mainly through sponsoring its leader, who proclaimed himself earlier this year as interim president, and threatening military intervention. Most powers in the Latin American bloc have backed these efforts, but have specifically denounced any military intervention. They rebuke military intervention on the grounds of anti-U.S. interventionist sentiment, mainly birthed out of the Cold War interventions that the U.S. imposed throughout the region. I'll conclude this slide just by pointing out the two pictures. On the right is Nicolás Maduro and what could be said to be his military cabinet, because he has an over-reliance on the military to keep control of the country. And to the left are President Donald Trump, Mike Pence, and Marco Rubio, the main advocates for pressure of Venezuela in the American government, pictured with Lilian Tintori, who is the wife of jailed opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation just by going over, like I said, the main points of my presentation. In the first section, I outlined how Venezuela shares a similar and rich history of independence, with the exception that it shares a similar and rich history of independence with its neighbors. But as I was saying, with the exception that it was the first country to formally separate from Spain, and it was also the birthplace of Simón Bolívar, who went and liberated other countries in the region. In my second section, I overviewed how Venezuela has had several patterns of mismanagement which have plundered the country. And these can be especially evidenced by the ongoing humanitarian crisis today. And lastly, in the last section, I went over how a history of friction has really pinned the U.S. against Venezuela. In turn, the U.S. has led efforts to change the current regime and see if through peace, not only it can satisfy the growing call of its neighbors, but also have an administration that it can work better with. And with all these points in mind, I'll just wrap up my presentation by saying that Venezuela really does have the potential to recover from the crisis that it's weathering right now. A lot of experts have pointed out how Venezuela is a resource-rich country, and it has overwhelming potential, not only to benefit itself with its resources and its human capital, because there are a lot of professionals come out of Venezuela, but it has the potential to benefit the region as a whole. Hopefully, we'll see Venezuelan peace reigning in the few weeks, and the country will move forward from the crisis it's enduring today. Thank you.